Hello everyone, and welcome to an online discussion on the parliamentary elections in Hungary, which happened yesterday. I am Gytė Augustinaitytė, project assistant at the Geopolitics and Security Studies Center, and I will moderate our conversation today. And with us, we have a great analyst, Krisztián Jójárt, who is currently a postdoctoral researcher at Swedish Defence University. And I'm sure that he will give us some great insights on what has happened and what might happen in the country. I will have quite a few questions from my side, and then we will turn to the questions from the audience. So I encourage everyone to type their questions in the chat box, and we will try our best to integrate them into our discussion today. Just a short overview of the latest results. So according to data from the Hungarian National Election Office, 98.94% of votes have been already counted. And our Homeland Movement got 3% and secured 6 seats at the National Assembly. Fidesz got 27.6% and secured 55 seats. And TISA, the winners, 67.4% and secured 138 seats, which is more than a constitutional majority. Just first, very brief question. How would you evaluate the results? What surprised you and what did not?
Thank you very much. So thank you for having me. So it's a landslide victory, as you said rightly. It's a 2/3 constitutional majority that TISA gained throughout this election, which I think was unexpected. The TISA victory was expected. It was getting closer to the elections a couple of days before the election. I think it was expected that they will get a sizable majority, but to get a very comfortable supermajority, a 2/3 constitutional majority, I think that was over the expectations of all the political analysts, and it was also visible if you watched the Hungarian live broadcasts on this election and the political analysts that expressed their opinions. Just after the voting places were closed at 7, the two most reliable Hungarian pollsters provided their data that was measured between April 8 and April 11. And so the one of them is Median, which measured that TISA might get between 131 and 139 seats in the parliament. So they measured that it would be on the edge of constitutional majority, and the 21 research center providid a more conservative data, but mostly they're the same figures, 132, so just below 2/3 majority. And they also measured that the far-right party, Mi Hazánk, Our Fatherland, would be on the brink of getting into the parliament. And I think this victory has showed that these pollsters were actually very reliable, because they measured exactly the outcome. But this high majority was even beyond their expectations.
Thank you. I would like to move to the winners and a bit talk through the election campaign. So we saw quite different election campaigns, right? Orbán focused on portraying Volodymyr Zelensky as well as other European officials as the main enemy for the country, while largely avoiding the domestic issues. Magyar, on the other hand, focused more on internal matters than foreign policy. What does this tell us about Magyar? Is this simply a campaign strategy, or does it signal a broader agenda that puts forward domestic issues and leaves foreign policy at the end of the page?
I think it tells more about, on the one hand, the general voter preferences in, I think, any country, which, the voters, the overwhelming majority of the voters decide based on domestic political issues, and they don't really care about foreign policy. In the Hungarian aspect, what was particular is Fidesz the governing party, Orbán's party, has been focusing exclusively on foreign policy issues, which is not new, and I think it stems from many things. On the one hand, Orbán's early experience, I think, having led the country between 1998 and 2002, so his first term before the current 16 years period, when his personal conviction was that campaigning with very decent economic results did not bring about a victory in the elections in 2002. This is very typical to the Hungarians, and Orbán has expressed this multiple times in many interviews, that the Hungarians are always complaining about the economic situation. So that was there on the one hand. That's why I think they focused on foreign policy. Secondly, Orbán personally, for many years, have been noted already about him that the playground of Hungary is too small for him personally. So he had higher ambitions. He was like playing, 3D chess on the world global chessboard. He had European ambitions, so it was also his personal conviction. And thirdly, and most potentially from the campaign point of view, the most important factor was that there was not too much to brag about when it comes to the performance of the current government in the past 5 years. So in the past 16 years, the first period was relatively good. There was an economic boom. The economic performance of this system was pretty good. But it was also thanks to the EU monies and also the general wider European economic environment. And after the COVID and after the war came in Ukraine, of course, there was an economic downturn. So in the past 5 years, there was zero growth. We saw double-digit inflation, especially food prices inflation was really high, and the deteriorating public services. So it was understandable that they did not focus on domestic political issues because there was not much to tell. And also Orbán's experience from 2015, when there was the refugee crisis in Europe, was that threatening with external instability and external threats pays off. And he saw a moment in the war in Ukraine. So the previous elections had occurred just after the war broke out in Ukraine, after Russia attacked Ukraine in 2022. And again, that resulted in a 2/3 majority for Fidesz, because Fidesz has managed to effectively instrumentalize the threat of war. And they did the same now before the elections. They deliberately tried to provoke the Ukrainians into overreacting and provide a core truth for the narrative being built around that Ukraine represents a threat and Ukraine tries to interfere in the Hungarian elections. So mostly the foreign policy issues was basically ruled by the governing Orbán party. There was no space to break into by the TISA, and also because of the overwhelming media rule of the Orbán government and the narratives that were very heavily pushed toward the electorate. But also it was, of course, it would have made zero sense for TISA party to step into this field when they managed to campaign effectively by showing the large-scale corruption, which was very difficult, impossible to hide by the Orbán government. Also pointing out the bad public services, education, healthcare, first and foremost, economic stagnation. So they clearly wanted to keep the narrative in the realm of domestic politics, whereas Fidesz always tried to talk about foreign policy and tried to have foreign policy as the dominant narrative throughout the elections. They managed, I think, in the end of the election campaign, Fidesz, I mean, to shift the balance toward foreign policy issues because of the anti-Ukraine propaganda started to have dividends already, payoffs, as Zelensky had his slip of tongue when he basically threatened Orbán. So the Russian attack against the Druzhba pipeline and Hungarians threatened supply of Russian oil. So these were falling in peace for the government, and then Tisza also managed to step into the field of foreign policy. Also, the crisis in Iran, of course, was on the one hand, it was advantageous for the government because also showed that Hungary's vulnerability in the very unstable international environment, and Fidesz wanted to show by keeping the attention on foreign policy that it's not the time to make unsolid, unreliable decisions by letting someone completely new lead the country. So basically, Fidesz slogan was the stable choice. We know Fidesz, we know all their mistakes, but they are keeping their hands firmly on the steering wheel of Hungary, and it's not the right time to jump here and there and start to experiment with something new. Basically, that's what their only promise in the elections, that we will continue, we will provide stability, and so on and so forth. And also there was a parallel line here. I think I think it's important to add, that was beyond the control of Tisza party. So Tisza still focused on on domestic political issues, but on the other hand, investigative journalists started to disclose all the very inconvenient aspects that were in the realm of foreign policy, the very close ties, inconveniently close ties to the Russians, the intercepted phone calls between Foreign Minister Szijjártó and Sergei Lavrov, Foreign Minister of Russia. Also, there was a Bloomberg transcript of one phone call between President Putin and Prime Minister Orbán. So there was this parallel track, which was due to the independent media and also like foreign interested actors who were interested in disclosing, of course, this information, which pushed the narrative a bit toward the very end of this election campaign toward foreign policy. But the choices were understandable, I think, on both sides. Campaign team, both the Fidesz party and Tisza's parties, of focusing on foreign policy on side of the Fidesz and domestic politics on the side of the Tisza. But they do not necessarily represent priorities. I mean, yes, priority, of course, for the Tisza will be to dismantle as much as possible the system that has been built up in the past 16 years. Also to have a better social care and fix the most aching aspects of the system, the most burning issues. But foreign policy will be very crucial and important because Tisza needs to build back the trust toward Hungary within its alliance system. And also, most importantly, Tisza needs to take back the EU money that Hungary is entitled but currently is being held back by the European Union. So foreign policy, I think, will be very high on the agenda. And we will know more, of course, after this afternoon when we will have the first international press conference by Tisza party and the new elected government of Hungary.
There are some concerns that Peter Magyar was a former member of Fidesz party. Viktor Orbán did not start out as the leader he is today, for sure. His system became more radical over time as power concentrated. Now we see Peter Magyar broke away from Fidesz, created TISA, and now is promising change. But how real is that break? What are the risks that Hungary could end up with an Orbán version 2?
Well, to be honest, despite all my joy and happiness seeing the election result, I also have serious concerns, not because I doubt Peter Magyar's intentions and good intentions, regardless that he is coming from Fidesz. He's a conservative center-right figure, and there is no problem with that. My concern is that basically this whole TISA party and this movement is not a result of a natural democratic process. So it is the product of the system of 16 years of autocratic system by the Orbán government, which made this whole electoral system a bipartisan system. So the only way to change the system was to unify behind an opponent of Fidesz, which was represented by this huge party TISA. But this is a very heterogeneous voter basis, and Peter Magyar, of course, knows that. He knows that, and he even expressed it in his victory speech, that he is well aware that many of the voters of TISA voted not for him personally and because he agrees with TISA, but because they wanted regime change. So the main concern for him will be, and again, referring to what Viktor Orbán said in his speech after the election, is that they are not, so the burden of governments is not anymore on their shoulders. Their main task will be to build back their community, to keep together the community. And of course, it's a real threat that they will prove more effective in keeping their core Fidesz voter base as opposed to the very heterogeneous voter bases of TISA. So yeah, the risks are manifold. On the one hand, 4 years from now, Fidesz, of course, could return to power. TISA, of course, is well aware of this risk. So yes, there are risks that TISA will not rush to dismantle this whole system until at least Fidesz is not weakened to the extent that it would not pose a threat to the next elections, that it would come back and start or continue to build this autocratic system. So before that, I think the main priority would be to weaken Fidesz to the extent that it would not pose a threat before they start to dismantle this whole system and this electoral system particularly, that favors this very bipartisan electorate model.
You've mentioned before a system that Orbán has built over the past 16 years. So especially given signals that Fidesz may attempt to pass last-minute reforms and changes before leaving office, how do you expect the transfer of power to unfold in practice? How contentious or constrained could this transition period become?
Well, according to the Hungarian constitution, you can't really make, as a managing government, any major change that would shift the track of the government or restrict the movement of the new elected government. The problem is that the constitution is not very specific and detailed, so it's not a menu that would provide a detailed list of what's possible and what's not possible for the managing government to do. But I think so. On the other hand, of course, there are 30 days to form a new parliament. Péter Magyar already called the president not to delay this process and to have as smooth a transition of power as possible. And I honestly don't believe that the Orbán government would try to do anything, anything significant, because they understand that this legitimacy that TISA now gained during the elections, this swiping landslide victory, is so high that doing anything to trying to constrain their move, the transition, the transfer of the power, would be counterproductive. Orbán congratulated Péter Magyar. He called on the phone when it was obvious yesterday that TISA won the election, which move was not evident, I think. And many political analysts could not imagine it happening. I was also very skeptical about this gesture to be made by Orbán, and also taking into account the Russian interference in the election campaign. There were very gloomy scenarios. On the other hand, I think there was a clear indication by Minister of the Prime Minister's office, Gergely Gulyás, when he stood on the podium after the closing of the ballot places. So there was nothing known about the results yet. Of course, since Fidesz is doing internal surveys, they, I think, were well aware that they will lose this election big time. But they already saw that the voter turnout is record high. So it was nearly 80%, which is 79 point something percent, which is really the highest turnover or turnout ever since the democratic history of Hungary. And Gergely Gulyás said that even though claiming that this high turnout favors Fidesz, but you could see on their face, on his face and the other Fidesz politician, Lőrinc Nacsa, who stood next to him, that they were aware that this high turnout is not going to favor Fidesz, this time at least. And he said that whatever the outcome is, they believe that this high turnout favors Fidesz, but whatever the outcome is, it is evident that the new government will have a huge legitimacy. And I think that was a crucial sentence in this regard, and that also, I think, binds the hands of the managing Orbán government to do any stupid things in the upcoming few weeks before handing over the power, because it would be a very delicate moment. So seeing the streets of Budapest yesterday after the election, it was really cathartic. So you see many young people spreading the streets, celebrating the victory of TISA. So I think they are wise enough to know that there would be nothing good for them to try to hinder this process. I think what they are hoping for is that they could come back 4 years from now. There would be a very difficult economic situation for the new government, but it's not the time to try to do anything to keep the power, because it would be totally pointless and counterproductive.
One of the topics which, to my mind at least, was not addressed enough during this election campaign was Russian interference. Having in mind the result, how significant has it been? We saw a couple of in the news, we saw that there was disinformation campaigns, AI tools were used to create videos. There have also been more extreme tactics proposed, such as staging an assassination attempt of Orbán. So what impact have such efforts had on this election campaign and on the result as well?
I wouldn't over-exaggerate the impact of the Russian interference, not least because we see what the election result is. I think so. We saw published by these information about the arrival of 3 additional GRU Russian military intelligence officers to Hungary. We also saw other leaked information, the staged assassination attempt against Orbán, as a plan for that, proposed by the SVR, the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, and it was disclosed by Catherine Belton in her Washington Post report. We don't really know that whether it was an accepted plan by the Kremlin or it was just merely a proposal. What I think is evident from this, whatever, if it's a plan or a proposal it was, is that the Russians were also aware that they would need to do a very radical move to keep Orbán in power. So I think both the Orbán government and the Russians knew that they won't win the election unless something very radical is pulled off. To contain these potential Russian false flag operations, interference, I think, and of course we don't really know, again, how much impact in containing these threats were for the disclosure of this information by Western partners and journalists and other experts and researchers who were focusing on Russia and the potential Russian interference. One case in point was the attempt or staged attempt against the Turkish Stream pipeline in Serbia, which was very likely a Russian false flag operation. Whether it was coordinated with the Hungarian government or the Hungarian government was kept in the unknown, we don't know for sure. But my dear friend and colleague András Schratz actually disclosed that information, that it would be a logical step on behalf of the Kremlin to try to do something on the territory of Serbia, tampering with the pipeline there, the Turkish gas pipeline. So it didn't come as a shock. It was not a surprise because again, the researchers and the investigative journalists had warned for this possibility for a very long time. And it sort of mitigated, I think, both the threat and the extent the Russians were willing to go to carry out these operations, and not least how the Serbian government reacted to this event around the Turkish Stream gas pipeline. So there was nothing blowing up there. They found the bomb there. The Serbian military intelligence stood out and they said that the origin of the bomb was actually American. The suspects involved were migrants. So there was no clear tie to the Ukrainians. Of course, the Hungarian government propaganda tried to sell it as, potentially coming from Ukraine, but not really effectively. And it also showed, I think, that the Serbians were not really willing to assist to this Russian force flag operation because of Serbia's own national interests and the Serbian ruling elite's interest in that regard. So I would certainly not over-exaggerate the role of the Russian influence in this campaign, but also it might be the case that many things were avoided because we had excellent investigative journalists and experts who warned to the prospect that these events might take place. So that influenced the calculus of the Kremlin and the Russian intelligence services to carry out these operations.
Now, moving to the foreign policy, which is, of course, a very important aspect of our discussion, Ukraine. Keeping in mind that Jójárt did not pay much attention to foreign policy during his election campaign, especially on the matters of Ukraine, his position on this issue is quite unclear. While some European officials hope that a possible change, that now we see that it's not a possible, it will change in the government in Hungary could lead to lifting vetoes on EU's 90 billion loan to Ukraine, as well as military support to Kiev via the European Peace Facility Fund. Others do really argue that the situation, especially on bilateral Ukraine and Hungary relations, might not change significantly. So what do you think? What do these elections results actually mean for Ukraine?
Well, I think the vetoes against the EU loan to Ukraine and of course potentially the new sanctions package against Russia will be accepted. I think I don't see why it would be in the interest of both Hungary and the new Hungarian government to keep vetoing the 19 billion European aid to Ukraine, so surely these vetoes will be relieved. On the bilateral issues, of course, the question of the Hungarian minority, which comes to mind as the most burning issue. We know that the Ukrainians proposed an action plan last year, so the Ukrainians made a couple of points to reach a compromise. The Orbán government did not react to these proposals because obviously they were using the issue of the Hungarian minority living in Ukraine as just rationalizing why they are doing what they are doing against Ukraine, while it is now quite obvious that they were doing their actions in the interest of Russia. So I think this would surely be put on the table. I think a compromise on this issue is very likely. I see incentive also on the side of the Zelensky leadership to be very cooperative with this new Hungarian government, also to demonstrate that the very aggressive approach of the Orbán government did not pay off throughout the years, and serving this gift to the new government as a compromise would be a nice gesture on behalf of the Ukrainians. On Ukraine's EU accession issue, the stance of the Magyar government would be more ambiguous, I think, based on the campaign promises. Also due to the Hungarian government propaganda, which tuned the Hungarian population against Ukraine to a significant extent, restricts somewhat the room for maneuver. So based on their national consultation carried out by the TISA party, it turned out that the issue of Ukraine's EU accession also divides their own voting camp. So the majority of the TISA voters favored Ukraine's EU accession, but not to the extent as the overwhelming majority of respondents to other questions asked during this questionnaire or during this consultation. But I think, so on the first hand, Ukraine's fast-paced accession to the EU is clearly off the table. So I think it was never on the table because there was no prospect of doing that, because Ukraine's EU accession would require significant institutional reform also of the European Union, not to mention all the reforms on behalf of Ukraine. So it will not be a very fast and quick process. It was only in the Orbán government's interest to paint this as a so-called quote-unquote imminent threat to Hungary that Ukraine's EU accession is knocking on our doors. On the other hand, TISA does not perceive this being a possibility, rightly so. So I think TISA government assesses that it is at least a decade-long process. The chance is high that it will not be TISA government's issue to deal with. And of course, since it's a long process with many steps, there are many opportunities to veto the process of Ukraine's EU accession at any point. And in the end, as the campaign promise was by TISA, it will be put on a national referendum in Hungary. But it doesn't mean, I think, that the start of the EU accession negotiations is what is being put on the national referendum in Hungary. It will be the closure of the issues and the final decision about Ukraine's EU membership that would be put on a national vote, and that's very far in the distant future. So I think TISA will not veto the start of Ukraine's EU accession process. So this veto is being levied, I think, very soon after the new government takes office.
We have one question from the audience, which also relates to Ukraine. How does Hungarian public opinion view Russia's war against Ukraine and support for Ukraine, and how much is it influenced by government messaging?
So the answer is, I think that the Hungarian government propaganda did a considerable damage to the Hungarian, well, I would say to the whole mentality, the whole mind of the Hungarian population writ large, but particularly in the Hungarian-Ukrainian relationship. So every public survey now shows that Zelensky's popularity equals to Putin's popularity. So the Hungarian population just as much dislikes Zelensky as it does Putin. But on the positive note, when you question these people about what they know about Ukraine, why they relate to Ukraine the way they do, they just keep repeating the Hungarian government propaganda panels, which in my view is a good sign, because there are no deep historical grievances toward Ukraine or between the two societies, between Ukrainians and Hungarians. The main issue that it was a fertile ground for the Hungarian state propaganda because of the lack of knowledge about Ukraine. So the average Hungarian knows very little about Ukraine. And of course, the average Ukrainian knows very little about Hungary and Hungarians too. So it's kind of a blank page, I think. I am more hopeful that if the new government comes to office, if the Hungarian state propaganda ceases to exist and keep spreading this anti-Ukrainian narrative, actually the stance toward Ukraine or the Hungarian mentality toward the Ukrainians would be healed faster than many expect. But yes, unfortunately, the past 4 years of very intense propaganda did a considerable damage to the Hungarian population and the reputation of Ukraine in the Hungarian population. That said, I would also emphasize that there were and there still are very significant Hungarian civil initiatives to help Ukraine, and also particularly the Ukrainian armed forces. I would mention the Kárpátaljai Sárkányellátó Foundation, which provides non-lethal aid to Ukrainian military units. They started with focusing on particularly military units in the Zakarpattia region, where most Hungarians live, but they also expanded their aid to other Ukrainian military units, and also providing significant help to Ukrainian hospitals, kindergartens, and many other places in Ukraine they are present. So that also shows, I think, that there is a sense within the Hungarian population that we should repair the damage done by the current Hungarian government in the Ukrainian-Hungarian relationship. So I think the Hungarian population is divided in the issue of help to Ukraine. But I would also respond to this question in a way that I would not expect that Hungary would start supplying military aid to Ukraine. That's totally out of the question, not the least because there is not much, I think, on the first hand that Hungary could supply Ukraine with in the form of military aid, but also because that would be a very risky move from the new Hungarian government to do that and go against the hard propaganda of the past 4 years. So military aid to Ukraine that's totally out of the question, but I'm more hopeful in repairing the two nations' relationship in a shorter time frame than I think many would expect.
Thank you. It's very interesting that over the 40 minutes of our discussion, we didn't mention the U.S. So I would like to jump into these bilateral relations. Hungary's ties with the U.S. have become increasingly personalized in recent years, particularly through Viktor Orbán's close relationships with current U.S. administration figures such as Donald Trump himself, or even J.D. Vance, who was recently in Budapest and actively participated in one of the Orbán's rallies. At the same time, Peter Magyar has signaled a willingness to rebuild trust with NATO allies as well as increase defense spending. How might U.S.-Hungary relations evolve if, when a government comes to power that wasn't backed by the current U.S. administration, but still kind of seeks closer security ties? And could this create tensions or might increase defense investment, even, for example, including potential purchases of the U.S. military equipment, open the door to a more pragmatic relationship? J.D. Vance mentioned that they would still work with Hungary since they love the Hungarian people, but how would this work in practice?
Well, as you rightly mentioned, it's a very personalistic relationship, as Trump and the new MAGA movement and the new administration, and it has been codified in the new national security strategy as well, is clearly interested to keep in power the like-minded, the liberal political regimes in Europe, and to facilitate an illiberal regime change, I think, in Europe. But on the other hand, I would also note that despite of the very close personal ties between Orbán and Trump, and also between certain U.S. think tanks and pro-government think tanks in Hungary, this whole relationship did not really bear fruit in a practical way. So there is not much that came from the first Trump administration, despite Orbán's early endorsement of Trump. And there is not much concrete outcome of this very good personal ties for Hungary as a state fell off from this personal good relationship between Trump and Orbán. I think clearly the TISA government's priority will be to repair the relationship with the European allies. So Péter Magyar's first visit will come to Warsaw. He will try to repair the traditionally very strong bonds between Hungary and Poland. His next visit will be to Vienna. as also, again, a traditional, usually the first visit for the new prime minister of any color in Hungary. It takes to Vienna, another neighboring country, and his third station would be Brussels, and to renegotiate how Hungary could bring back the money that it is entitled to get. And I think Washington is not very high on the agenda for the new TISA government. But on the other hand, as you also rightly noted, J.D. Vance, despite his endorsement of Orbán, he answering, I think, to the Reuters reporter question, he said that, of course, the United States will cooperate with whatever government of Hungary, because Hungary is an ally of the US. So I think, and Péter Magyar also emphasized that they are seeking pragmatic cooperation with the US and also with other allies. So instead of this very personalistic foreign policy, which again, I think the main purpose of all this was to keep the Orbán regime in power. So domestic politics and foreign policy was very difficult to divide for the Orbán government, because clearly from a certain point of their ruling, their main interest was to keep in power the regime. So regime security governed the foreign policy, is what I'm saying. And the Orbán government was interested in supporting like-minded regimes in Europe and was hoping for a regime change in bigger European countries such as France and Germany, and they placed their stakes on that. And there was nothing good actually for the Hungarian national interest coming from this relationship. And what we will see most likely is a more traditional diplomacy returning to the Hungarian foreign policy, which instead of personalistic relationships favors Hungary's core national interest and Hungary's deep embeddedness in the European Union and the NATO. And the most important priority will be to reestablish, repair trust on behalf of our allies toward Hungary, which has been lost significantly in the past 16 years.
I know that we're running a bit over time, but I still have one last question. What do these election results mean for countries like Slovakia and Serbia, which have been among Orbán's closest allies in Europe? Could this shift its focus more strongly to Russia's focus towards those countries, since Hungary is kind of falling out of its hands?
Yeah, so the current Hungarian government was Russia's most important asset in the Western alliance, because through the Hungarian government, Russia was able to veto or at least delay certain European decisions. Also, now we know that Foreign Minister Szijjártó informed Sergei Lavrov throughout his regular phone calls with him about EU decisions, about Hungary's stance in the sanctions regime, and also at one point Szijjártó asked not Lavrov but I think the deputy prime minister to provide some bullet points that would explain why it is in Hungary's interest to delist some Russian entities that has nothing to do with Hungarian oil trade, because it was focusing on these were shipping companies, I think registered in Dubai, and it was very hard to explain why Hungary wants to delist them from the sanctions list, because it was hard to reason with the Hungarian national interests. So at that point, Szijjártó asked his Russian counterpart to provide some bullet points to help sell it in the European Union. So it's a huge loss for us, for Russia, I think. In Slovakia, with Fico, they still have, of course, a sort of partner in the Western alliance. But we also saw that Slovakia is not really willing to go as far, I think, as the Orbán government in vetoing certain issues, and it proved more pragmatic. Particularly in the bilateral Slovakian-Hungarian aspect, I think the relationship will be tense, not least because of the new law in Slovakia that it's criminalizing talking about criticizing the Beneš decree, which is an anti-minority law in Slovakia that significantly puts the Hungarian minority in a very bad situation. So in the question of the Hungarian minority in Slovakia, I think that would be certainly a point of tension between Hungary and Slovakia. And the Fidesz government was not really willing to confront Fico because of his ideological alliance with him. But I think the new TISA government will very likely be a lot more confrontative in that regard with Slovakia. As far as Serbia is concerned, I think a good case in point is now the false flag operation, and that how Serbia communicated about that. Serbia's number one priority, of course, is getting closer to the European Union, and I think the Serbian government, despite again its ideological alliance and friendship between Vučić and Orbán, is not interested in deteriorating the EU-Serbian relationship. It was also not interested, apparently, to deteriorate the relationship between Serbia and Ukraine, particularly because Serbia also supplies or provides military aid under the radar to Ukraine. So I think that was also one reason why they were not willing to assist in covering up this false flag operation on the territory of Serbia. So I think the relationship between Serbia and Hungary could be seen in this context, and that's what will determine the short-term relationship between the two countries. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Krisztián, for your insights. It was a very interesting conversation. Thank you to everyone who listened. I'm very sorry that we kept you here for longer than we promised, but I think it was a lively and interesting discussion. And let's see what the future brings us, what happens next.
Thank you, and thank you very much for having me.